Hello everyone, and welcome to my third video on stamp collecting. In this video, I'm going to discuss stamp quality and stamp grading. In past videos, I've advanced the idea that stamp collecting is an act of preservation. As part of that act of preservation, I recommend that you collect the highest quality stamps available, simply because high quality objects are more likely to survive. This is just human nature. We respond to quality. People are much more likely to preserve and protect and pass on to future generations objects of high quality. So that brings us to the issue for today. How do we assess the quality of a stamp? How do we grade a stamp? So when we're assessing the quality of a stamp, we're doing so in four broad categories. Now, I should say four categories for used stamps and four categories for unused stamps, but three of those categories are the same for both. When we're looking at a stamp, the first thing we look for are major faults, creases, tears, thins, and so on. And shortly, I will show examples of all of these major faults. Then we look at the minor faults, short perfs, bump perfs, bent perfs, and so on. And again, I will show examples of these in a moment. Centering is the last of the three main categories for assessing the quality of a stamp, and it's simple in concept. How well centered is the image with respect to the edges of the stamp? But it takes a lot of experience to distinguish the finer grades of a stamp. How does a VF80 compare to a VFXF85, for example? Later in the video, I present a grid of stamps that differ ever so slightly from one another with regard to centering to help viewers distinguish the finer grades of stamps. For used stamps, the cancel matters, and I will be presenting a series of stamps that show the different grades of cancellations from obliterated all the way through to light. Finally, for unused stamps, the gum matters. How much the gum matters is a hotly debated issue, but I'm not going to get into that debate. I'm just going to show examples of several different qualities of gum. Unfortunately, I don't have examples of all of the different qualities of gum, but I have enough to help viewers distinguish between the good, the bad, and the ugly. So let's take a look at the major faults. First up, we have creases. Creases are perhaps the most common fault among stamps. Can you find the crease in this picture? It's in the upper right corner. This is an example of a corner crease, and the corner crease is perhaps the most common of all of the creases. Sometimes creases are not visible to the eye, and this is why we use watermarking fluid on the stamps. Of course, we use watermarking fluid to detect watermarks, but watermarking fluid is excellent at revealing all of the defects in the paper of a stamp. Here's another example. In this example, I might not say that the paper is creased, but certainly it is distressed. Again, watermarking fluid is quite good at revealing the defects in the paper. Next up, we have tears. Unfortunately, because we must separate stamps from one another, tears are a common occurrence. Thins are also revealed under watermarking fluid, but I think it helps to also look at the stamps against bright white light. Okay, so some thins may not appear under the watermarking fluid, but will appear against the bright white light. Essentially, the thin appears white when the stamp is held up against the bright white light. Here's another stamp that shows that effect fairly clearly. Okay. The thin here is quite small, but it pops out when the stamp is held up against the bright white light. Watermarking fluid isn't as good at revealing faults on modern stamps as it is uh, the classical or vintage stamps. Okay, the breakpoint is around 1970. Okay, so stamps made after 1970 tend to be thicker and they tend to have a lot of white space, and as a consequence, um, the watermarking fluid is not as good at revealing faults as the bright light. So I just uniformly use both. I check my stamps under watermarking fluid. I check the stamps against bright white light to detect any faults. Well, unfortunately, a lot of stamps do get stained. This is the principal reason that we remove stamps from paper. It's also why you should never drink coffee anywhere near your stamps. Surface damage is quite common in stamps as well because the mail goes through machines. The stamp looks pretty good, but on close inspection, a scratch is apparent running across the gold metal. Sometimes the cancel itself can damage a stamp, as in this example. If you look carefully, you can see that the cancel has actually punched into the stamp, leaving an indentation in the stamp, which qualifies as surface damage. Here's an example of wrinkling. Yes, stamps can actually wrinkle. This is a common occurrence among stamps from the 1980s and the early 1990s. I don't know the technical details as to why it happens, but it's certainly annoying. Here we have an example of pinholes in a stamp. Now these are not perfins. Perfins are perforations drilled into the stamp to form letters or words or symbols. Okay, that's a different issue altogether. These are pinholes made by pins, thumbtacks, quite often. Although in this case, it might have been a staple. So someone may have stapled this stamp to a piece of paper. Either way, it's surface damage, and it's a major fault. Now, most faults associated with perforations are minor faults, but the pulled perf is a major fault. In the pulled perf, some of the paper below the perforation line has actually been pulled away from the stamp. Toning is another reason that we take stamps off the paper to which they have been affixed. Envelope paper is often very acidic, and that acid damages the stamp over time. In effect, the stamp burns. The stamp oxidizes. So the color of the stamp paper shifts from that nice bright white when the stamp is new to darker and darker shades of burnt. Sunlight is rather bad for stamps, especially modern stamps. Many of the inks in modern stamps are highly volatile, and just a little sunlight will cause some dramatic color shifts. So do not leave your stamps in the sun. Finally, many stamps have been altered or repaired to make them look like more expensive stamps. Now, often uh, common stamps are altered to look like rare stamps. For example, a 344 may be perforated to look like a 519. But some fairly common stamps have been altered or repaired as well. Here, for example, we have a 375. A 375 is not a particularly rare stamp, but this copy has been altered to make it look better than it once was. Most likely, this stamp had a straight edge on the left, or perhaps a really long left edge. So someone reperforated the left side to make it look like a better stamp. How can you tell? Well, in this case, the perforations at the top, on the right, at the bottom, have a lot more paper fibers than the perforations on the left. Another way of saying that is the perforations on the left are cleaner. The perforations on the other three sides are fuzzy. Often it takes an expert to find these kinds of alterations or repairs. So I advise if you have any stamp that's in any way questionable, send it to the experts for authentication. On to the minor faults. The short perf is the most common of the minor faults. A short perf is about 50% or less than the length that it should be. In this example, the short perfs are in the lower left. This stamp also shows a long perf. The term long perf doesn't show up in the literature. You may see the term uneven perfs in the literature. That just describes perforations that are of different lengths along one side of the stamp. Uneven perfs don't qualify as a minor fault, but I do think they detract from the visual appeal of a stamp. Here we have an example of a bumped perf. Bumped perfs are very hard to detect. Take a moment, look around the edge, see if you can find the bumped perf. The third perforation on the bottom is the bumped perf. The perf isn't really bent. There isn't really a crease there. The paper is just a little distressed because the perforation somehow got bumped. Okay, so I'll draw a little line to show the bump, and then I will show the slides. I'll show the previous two slides again so you can see the stamp with and without the bump. Here we have a bent perf. This perf is most definitely bent. Can you find it? It's in the lower right corner. Now you could call this a corner crease because the perf that's bent happens to be the perf in the corner. So is this a major fault? Is this a minor fault? I don't think it matters. It's a fault, and it just doesn't look good. Next up, we have a blind perf. A blind perf is a perf that isn't there. Basically, the perforation pin didn't go through the paper. That's all there is to it. These are fairly rare. It took a long time for me to actually find this particular example. Sometimes people cut stamps apart using scissors. This is a terrible idea because you just can't cut a straight line using scissors. The perfs end up looking uneven, and there is nothing you can do to fix this. Don't try. Just leave these alone. Okay. The perfs will be uneven, and that's that. Here we have an example of an inclusion. An inclusion is a particle of some kind that gets embedded in the paper during the paper manufacturing process. So the inclusions are in the paper before the stamp is ever printed on the paper itself. So I'll give you a moment to look for the inclusion here. This one is subtle. The inclusion is fairly deep in the paper, so it appears more like a scuff mark on the surface than an actual inclusion. Often the inclusions are close to the surface, so the inclusion is prominent on the front of the stamp, but not the back, or vice versa. You also have to be careful to not confuse paper fibers for inclusions. Some paper fibers are not white, especially in older stamps. And this particular example has a prominent paper fiber on the right side near the center, close to the perforations. Okay, that's normal. That's okay. That's not considered a fault of any kind. So be careful. You know what's quote unquote normal for the paper and what is a foreign object. You know, an inclusion. Arguments can be made that inclusions are normal. So, but the real issue is whether or not the inclusion detracts from the appearance of the stamp. The next few examples are all tied to the inking of a stamp. This particular example shows ink loss. Now, I don't know exactly what happened. It could be the ink simply didn't get on the stamp, or it could be that the ink was scraped away in the printing process or later. But the loss of ink does detract from the visual appeal of the stamp. This stamp also is over-inked on the right side. Sometimes there's just too much ink in the press, and the result will be thick lines and some ink splatter. Here's another example of an over-ink stamp. In this case, the ink is actually bled off of the frame line and into the paper. The image on a stamp is often built up from 2 or more images, each printed in a different color. As a result, the registration, the alignment of these images can affect the overall appearance of a stamp. Now, I like to distinguish between registration errors and color registration errors. In a registration error, either the black ink is shifted with respect to the other colors, or one element of the stamp is shifted with respect to another element. In this particular example, the black ink is shifted to the right, and the result is a rather poor image. In this example, the black ink is shifted as well to the left with respect to the colors. And the result is an image that is actually quite hard to look at. It hurts the eyes. This particular stamp has a classic form with 2 major elements, the frame and the vignette. And in this example, the vignette is shifted down with respect to the frame. As a result, it's just not a very good looking stamp. Here we have a very dramatic example of poor color registration. In fact, some people might go so far as to call this a freak. Here's another example of poor color registration. The blue ink is shifted up and the red ink is shifted down, and the result is an image that just isn't clean or crisp. So that closes out the minor faults, and we can move on to the third major category for grading stamps, centering. Now, I don't care much for the qualitative terms used to describe the centering of a stamp, because they come from a time when stamps were generally poorly centered. The average stamp is no longer average when it comes to centering. Okay, so, in 1880, an average stamp, with regard to centering, was quite terrible. Right? So, I don't even have an example. But today, modern printing is so good that the average stamp would qualify as a fine or very fine stamp with respect to centering. Today we use a numerical grading scheme for the centering of stamps. A score of 100 means the image of the stamp is perfectly centered with respect to the edges. Now what I've done here is assemble a montage of stamps that differ ever so slightly from one another with regard to centering. Now I don't grade stamps for a living, so these numbers may not be accurate, but they're close. The stamp at the center I don't think is a Gem 100. It's close. It is certainly a superb stamp with regard to centering, but I don't think it's a 100. Finding a 100 is rare. It's quite rare to find a perfectly centered stamp. The stamps in the top row are shifted up. The stamps in the bottom row are shifted down. The stamps to the right are shifted to the right in ever increasing increments. And the stamps to the left are shifted to the left again in ever increasing increments. Modern stamps typically grade 70, 75, 80. Okay. It's rare to find a stamp that grades as low as a 50, and it's certainly rare to find a stamp that grades a 100. For used stamps, the cancel is the fourth major category for grading a stamp. Here I've assembled some examples that cover the range of possibilities in terms of cancellations. The language describes how much of the image is obscured by the cancel. So on the left, we have an obliterated stamp. Thank you very much, Postal Service. And then over on the right, a stamp which we could argue about, but I think that's a fairly heavy cancel. I have some pretty high standards. So here I have some examples that range from heavy to light. I tossed in a smudgy and a neat as well. The quality of a cancel affects the visual appeal of a stamp. In some cases, the cancel can detract from the visual appeal. A smudgy cancel just looks bad. Whereas a neat cancel can actually add to the visual appeal of a stamp. So in this case, I might actually take the neat stamp over the lightly canceled stamp, just because that cancel is crisp and clean, easy to see, and I think it really does add to the visual appeal of the stamp overall. Here are some more examples of heavy to light cancellations, with some variation in the light cancels on the right side. And on the far right, we have a face-free cancel. So in the face-free cancel, the cancel does not cover any part of the image of the stamp itself. Finally, we have the pen cancel. The pen cancel tends to draw lower prices than the other cancels. I'm not entirely sure why, other than it might be a matter of authentication. Anyone can scribble on a stamp. Okay, but I like the pen cancels. I think on many occasions a pen cancel can be quite attractive, as in this particular case. My general advice is don't reject a pen cancel just because it's a pen cancel. Okay, I think there's still some value there. For unused stamps, the gum matters. Some people may argue that the gum is on the back of the stamp and you never really see the back of the stamp, so why does the gum matter? I would argue that the goal is to preserve a stamp in as close to its original condition as possible, and that includes the gum. Unfortunately, the common practice in the distant past was to hinge stamps into an album. This was a terrible idea. It has always been a terrible idea. And it forever will be a terrible idea. If you have hinges, throw them out. Do not ever hinge a stamp. That's all I have to say on that. Over the years, many of the stamps that were hinged into albums have been removed from those albums, and as a consequence, hinge remnants remain. Actual pieces of the paper that form the hinge remain stuck to the stamp. In some cases, the hinge paper has lifted completely off the stamp, but the gum is disturbed where the hinge was attached to the stamp. Sometimes the gum on a stamp can actually crease the stamp itself. When the gum is applied, it might be thick in a few places. As the gum dries, it shrinks and creases the paper in the process. Sometimes the paper is fine and only the gum wrinkles. Sometimes the gum is not evenly applied across the surface of the stamp, and the gum might be missing from portions of the stamp. Sometimes the gum is disturbed for one reason or another. The reasons are certainly many. In either case, the loss of gum detracts from the value of the stamp. Do not touch the gum. Please, always, use tongs when handling stamps. If a stamp is not stored in a climate-controlled environment, the gum can glaze. The combination of high heat and high humidity cause the gum to melt. If the gum is pressed up against a smooth surface, the gum will be smooth and shiny when it resets. Be careful though, some gums are smoother and shinier than others. Different manufacturers use slightly different recipes for the gum and different techniques for applying the gum. So it helps to have several examples of a stamp to know what the gum should look like. Here's an example of craquelure, the French word for crackle. And this is okay. Basically, in low humidity environments, the gum cracks. So these cracks form in the gum. Do be careful though, if a stamp is in too dry an environment for too long, that gum will actually just release from the stamp. It crumbles and falls away. Okay, so a little craquelure, it's not an issue. But beyond this lies dust. I did want to take a moment to mention roller marks. Sometimes when you look at the back of a stamp, you may see these bands running across the back. Uh, these are okay. These are a consequence of the manufacturing process. Okay? So when the paper goes through the rollers in the printing press, the paper develops a little bit of a wave to it. Okay, so these bands are due to light being reflected at slightly different angles. It's nothing to worry about. Sometimes you will see the ink from one stamp stuck on the back of another. Although this is not optimal, it's okay. Many years ago, stamps were printed in sheets and stacked on top of one another. If the gum or the ink was not completely dry, the ink of one stamp would stick to the gum of the stamp above it. All right, so here I have an example of a mint no hinge original gum post office fresh stamp. Okay. When you're inspecting the gum of a stamp, you want to look at the gum at an oblique angle. Right? So you have some light in the distance and you hold up the stamp nearly flat and get the light to reflect off the gum. And when you see that reflected light, you should see essentially a mottled but smooth surface, as in this particular picture. Here's another example of a mint no hinge stamp. As I mentioned before, gum technology has changed over the years. Okay. Different manufacturers have different recipes for the gum. They have different means of applying the gum. So it's helpful to have several examples of the same stamp so you know what the gum should look like. So what I want to do now is show you some examples of fault-free stamps. And while looking at these examples, I'll make a few comments about stamp collecting in general. The most important thing I want to say is that it was easy to find examples of all the faults that I showed in this video. Faults are common, incredibly common. Fault-free stamps are the exception, not the rule. And it takes some concerted effort to verify that a stamp is free of any faults. This is the challenge, the frustration, and the joy of stamp collecting. For this part of the video, I have deliberately chosen to show some very common stamps. The point that I want to make is that just because a stamp is common doesn't mean it isn't valuable. Given all of the things that can go wrong, all the faults that can occur, I hope you can appreciate how beautiful these stamps really are, despite being common. Of course, I do have a few rarities in my collection as well. Thanks for watching, and happy hunting.